Today, let's explore how a paralyzed CEO hired a single dad as a driver and how he changed everything. Eleanor used to be the kind of powerful elite who never noticed the people serving her. By 32, she had forged Whitmore Dynamics into a deeply feared medical tech empire on the East Coast. Reporters called her the Steel Executive. She fueled her days on just 4 hours of sleep, endless marathon medals, and iron discipline. But one rainy night, all that corporate power was violently torn away in a single deafening crash. 12 months later, she sat completely alone inside her silent, glass-walled luxury mansion, navigating her world from a wheelchair, quietly accepting that her wealthy, successful story was already over. Then she hired a personal driver named Caleb Hunter, a struggling single dad who offered nothing but quiet, steady, loyal service. And somehow, impossibly, this hired hand changed absolutely everything. If you and I believe a simple worker can pull a broken CEO back from the edge, stay with me. New York City has a specific cruelty. A cruelty strictly reserved for those falling from absolute power. The town that once slapped Eleanor's face across business magazines did not pause for a second of sympathy. It just moved right along to the next big story, the next startup being built or destroyed. For years before the tragic accident, Eleanor was the corporate success story everyone wanted told. At 26, she took her father's failing biotech firm and brutally stripped it down to the bone. Then she forged Whitmore Dynamics, a massive business now employing over 3,000 loyal workers, and partnered with giant hospital networks across 14 different states. She walked into industry conferences with such quiet dominance that older executives twice her age nervously fixed their ties. She ran grueling marathons on Sunday mornings, closed 9-figure business deals by Monday afternoon, and slept soundly in a custom penthouse she designed herself, right down to the very last light bulb. Every single piece of her routine was deliberate, strictly controlled, and always advancing. Then came the dark night of November 14th. Just a late, perfectly routine corporate dinner. Nothing out of the ordinary. Her private car was navigating the wet streets of Lower Manhattan when her driver, Marcus, skidded out on a slick turn. The vehicle hopped the curb, slammed into a concrete wall, and violently rolled. Her hired driver died on impact. Rescuers pulled Eleanor from the twisted wreckage alive, but broken in terrible ways the surgeons described with cold, clinical calm. The truth hit weeks later, when she realized her legs simply would not move, no matter how hard she commanded them. The physical trauma to her lower spine was completely devastating. The medical team was honest, without being cruel. Partial paralysis, they told her, possibly permanent. Therapy might help, but prepare for a future that looks vastly different from the high-powered life you knew. She just lay there in that sterile hospital bed, staring blankly at the ceiling for hours. The next few months became an entirely different kind of disaster. Her fiancé, a highly charming architect named Derek, gripped her hand through the first 3 weeks of brutal recovery. But by month 2, he became noticeably distant. Let's look at this together. By month 3, her supposed equal walked out, claiming he wasn't built for a caregiver's life. As if her shattered spine was just an inconvenient lifestyle choice he was politely declining. I heard Eleanor never cried when he left. She had already retreated somewhere cold inside, a dark place where she felt almost nothing, and honestly, she preferred it. The media found her tragedy absolutely irresistible. Iron CEO falls, Whitmore heiress fighting for more than her corporate empire. Those headlines looked sympathetic on top, but they were ruthless underneath. Paparazzi camped out right outside the rehab center. Her own board of directors held secret meetings, without even inviting her. Her CFO, Sebastian Hale, a guy who wore his naked ambition like a cheap suit, started whispering to the board members. He was quietly planting dark seeds of doubt. Was the boss still sharp enough? Was she still the right image for a massive brand selling health and wellness to the world? Could a paralyzed CEO really lead Whitmore Dynamics into its next big corporate phase? Eleanor knew exactly what Sebastian was pulling. She always understood exactly what kind of man he was. But knowing it, and actually having the strength to fight back, are two different things. After leaving the hospital, she locked herself inside her massive family estate in Greenwich. A sprawling luxury mansion with wide hallways and a ground floor fully retrofitted for her wheelchair. That house was gorgeous, gigantic, and just completely, oppressively dead silent. Her assistant Amelia showed up every morning. Different nurses rotated through to manage her heavy medication schedule. Lucas Bennett, her physical therapist, came by 3 times a week and reported back carefully. He noted her recovery was dragging far behind what you'd expect for her age and fitness. But the guy never said what he was actually thinking. He didn't have to. You and I know the truth. Eleanor Whitmore had completely given up on ever getting better. She sat frozen at her desk for 12 to 14 hours a day. Work was the only language she still trusted. She mechanically chewed whatever Amelia brought her, tasting absolutely nothing. She hadn't even opened her bedroom curtains since the day she moved in. Her massive dressing room wall displayed 6 pairs of premium running shoes she would never wear again, and she spent one awful Tuesday night forcing herself to grab every single one of her old marathon medals, shove them in a box, and banish them. She couldn't stomach looking at them. She desperately wanted to erase any reminder of the powerful woman she used to be. Her driver of 6 months was this stiff, totally humorless guy named Gerald. He handed in his resignation on a Friday afternoon, barely offering an excuse. He just hit his breaking point. Dealing with Eleanor was a daily nightmare. Honestly, she had become straight-up impossible to work for. She thanked him with that freezing, distant politeness she gave everyone, then coldly ordered Amelia to hire a new personal driver. She figured it wouldn't matter. But stick with me, because we know she was dead wrong. As for me, I never expected this random Tuesday to be the day my luck finally turned. I gave up on luck the day that hospital called to tell me my sweet wife, Rachel, had passed away 4 years earlier on a freezing March morning, leaving our daughter, Grace, asleep in her car seat downstairs while I stood frozen in a sterile hallway, entirely forgetting how to breathe for a moment that dragged on for agonizing years. I'm 34 years old now. I rent a tiny 2-bedroom apartment over in Bridgeport with Grace. She's 7 now, with Rachel's bright eyes and a fierce, unyielding stubbornness I secretly know she inherited straight from me. I want to tell you his story. After his wife Rachel died, he drove long-haul trucks for 2 years to numb the heavy, endless grief. But when little Grace turned 5, he quit. He couldn't bear to keep leaving her. He took any gig he could find, delivering packages, driving for private transport services. Even a month guarding a night warehouse that reeked of cheap chemicals and regret. But his paycheck was always 2 weeks behind where it actually needed to be. He fell 3 full months behind on rent. His landlord, Frank, a broad-shouldered guy who had been incredibly patient, finally taped an eviction notice to Caleb's front door that previous Wednesday. Yet something pressed much harder than rent. A harsh letter from Hargrove and Welsh, the ruthless attorneys representing his late wife's family. Rachel's parents had officially filed legal paperwork demanding partial custody of little Grace. Their legal argument was exactly the nightmare he had always feared. Claims of financial instability, no fixed routine, and inadequate provision. The kind of harsh language that sounded perfectly reasonable on paper, but let me tell you, it felt like a knife to the chest reading it at 2 in the morning at a cramped kitchen table. Grace was his everything. Caleb was never a man who used a word like everything lightly. He spoke carefully, but in this specific case, that exact word was devastatingly accurate. Without Grace, his grueling last 4 years made no sense whatsoever. He was absolutely not going to lose her. He decided this with the same quiet finality he applied to everything. No drama, no big announcement, just a permanent line drawn deep in the sand. Then he saw the online listing for the personal driver position at my company, Whitmore Dynamics, on a job board. The salary I offered was nearly triple what he was currently making. My requirements were intense: spotless record, stellar references, physical fitness, total discretion, and round-the-clock availability. The listing also clearly noted that the role demanded serious emotional resilience along with the ability to work closely alongside an individual who had very specific accessibility needs. He read my warning twice, then called the office number and booked his interview. The morning of our interview, he laid out his best shirt. You know the kind, a 5-year-old white button-down, clean and pressed, showing no visible wear as long as you didn't look at it too closely. He drove his daughter to school, mentioning he had a very important corporate meeting. She just looked up with enormous brown eyes and whispered, "You always make things better, Dad. It's kind of your whole thing." Caleb honestly had no idea what to say to that. So he just kissed her forehead and climbed back into his car. My corporate lobby, where we held the interviews, was deliberately designed to make you feel entirely insignificant. Cold marble floors and a ceiling soaring 3 stories high. Young executives in tailored suits moved with the frantic urgency of people paid incredibly well to appear busy. Caleb sat in one of 8 chairs lined up outside my main conference room. Every other candidate wore tailored suits. He just wore that pressed white shirt and simple, clean dark trousers. He wasn't embarrassed by the stark contrast. Honestly, he felt absolutely nothing at all. He wanted the job, not the scenery. I, Amelia Brooks, conducted that first round of interviews myself. I was famously efficient and possessed the particular. You and I know difficult bosses. My assistant Amelia handled me so long nothing fazed her anymore. She churned through the applicant pool fast, ticking boxes off her mental checklist. Then she finally reached Caleb. She rattled off the usual interview questions, then paused, studying him just a beat longer than the rest. He wasn't even trying to impress her. Every other applicant performed, fixing their posture, shifting their tone, desperate for any reaction. Caleb sat completely still, answering like he was listing boring facts about some stranger's life. When Amelia asked how he managed stress, he actually stopped and thought before giving his answer. "I just don't panic. That is about all I can promise." I showed up near the end of the hiring session, not to interview anyone, just to watch. I rolled into the conference room doorway in my wheelchair, and the air in that space shifted instantly. Every remaining candidate sat up straight. I caught the reaction, totally unmoved by their sudden nerves. I scanned the row of chairs like someone digging for one useful tool in a junk drawer full of garbage. My gaze finally locked onto Caleb for a few seconds. He held my stare without flinching. I turned to my assistant. "That one," I said, and wheeled myself right back out. Amelia looked slightly shocked. Caleb simply ignored the both of us. I figured he was already running through the onboarding paperwork he'd have to sign later. As he got up to follow Amelia out, she grabbed his arm for a second. "Just a heads up, 3 drivers have quit this exact job in the past 8 months. He thought about that warning for a second, then muttered, "Good to know." He took the job. Picture that very first morning Caleb arrived at my estate. He eased the black company sedan into my driveway at 7:58, 2 minutes early. My past personal drivers always made a point to show up right at 8 flat. I found that kind of predictability to be seriously annoying. I clocked those 2 early minutes without saying a single word. Our morning routine locked in without any fuss. He opened my car door right before I even reached it. He hoisted my folded wheelchair into the trunk, like a guy who'd stayed up late Googling the exact steps just so he wouldn't mess it up. He never once offered to help me get into the sedan unless I clearly signaled that I needed help. He didn't narrate every single move. Both hands on the wheel. The radio stayed dead quiet unless I wanted it on, and he only spoke when I asked a direct question. I spent those first 3 days just waiting for him to do something that irritated me. He never did. He wasn't a kiss-up. He didn't hover around. He didn't ask how I felt or give me pathetic, gentle smiles meant to show how much he understood my terrible tragedy. He treated me exactly the way one capable adult treats another fully capable adult. Like the physical realities of my paralysis were just minor roadblocks we had to drive around. And the rest of my life was totally none of his business. It was incredibly disorienting. I was so used to everyone treating me like broken glass or a sob story, and I usually fired back with pure, icy hostility. You and I know that's rare. He was just there, solid, quiet, and absolutely reliable. You see, I found myself watching him in the rearview mirror, paying much more attention than I ever intended to. Our first real moment of friction happened on a Thursday. I was attending a medical tech conference on the west side, and the accessible entrance featured a steep concrete ramp that had not been properly maintained. My wheelchair caught a nasty gap in the broken concrete, and I instantly lurched sideways. Caleb was beside me in 2 quick steps, steadying things without grabbing. He gently adjusted my angle so I could navigate forward. Out of bitter habit, I didn't thank him. Unusual for a driver, he didn't look offended. Rolling through the doors, I heard him say calmly, "You're not weak. That ramp is just terribly designed." I froze for half a heartbeat, then I pushed inside. That single sentence haunted my mind for the entire boardroom meeting. Not because it was deeply profound, but because nobody had spoken to me like that in a very, very long time. Everyone else treated my physical limitations with the polite sadness of a funeral they were already attending. Caleb just saw a structural problem with a concrete ramp, as if I was perfectly fine and the ramp was what needed fixing. Let's be honest, the shift was tiny and I'd have missed it entirely if I wasn't paying close attention. 10 days into his employment, Caleb asked, politely but without any visible distress, if he could bring his young daughter along for a late evening pickup. His sitter canceled. The alternative meant leaving Grace home alone for 3 hours, which he absolutely refused to do. I sat in silence for a long moment. Finally, I muttered, "One time." Grace arrived wearing a purple winter jacket with a broken zipper, clutching a little paperback book about deep-sea creatures. She climbed into the front passenger seat with a focused seriousness that caught my eye instantly. The little girl didn't stare. She just told me hello with the firm directness of a kid raised to look people right in the eye, and opened her book. I watched her quietly for a few miles, saying absolutely nothing. It was Grace who finally broke the silence. Looking up from her anglerfish page, she spoke with pure curiosity and zero awareness of the awkwardness involved. "Do you remember what it feels like to run really fast?" The inside of the luxury sedan went totally dead still. I felt that innocent question hit deep behind my ribs, not as pain exactly, but intense pressure. Caleb kept his eyes fixed on the road. Then Grace spoke again, casual as if she were just talking about the evening weather. "Because if you can't run anymore, you can always just go look at things. That's what my dad always tells me. Moving isn't the point. Seeing is the point." I slowly turned my head to face the window. You know that feeling. The city blurred past in glowing light, and I stayed completely silent for miles. Reaching the estate, I exited the vehicle without saying a single word. Caleb guided the heavy wheelchair down. I moved toward my front door, then suddenly stopped. Without looking back, I simply said, "Good night, Grace." "Good night," Grace answered cheerfully, diving right back into her fish book. That night, for the first time since November, I reached over and pulled my heavy bedroom curtain open. I sat in the dark, staring out at the city lights and all that motion. You know that feeling, the indifferent beauty of a world that didn't stop for me. But right then, something small and incredibly stubborn started stirring deep in my chest. I didn't have a name for that feeling yet, but I left the curtains open. Spring crept into Greenwich just like always, cautious at first and then entirely committed. The trees lining my driveway. They went from dead branches to full bloom in what felt like a single week. After spending all fall and winter trapped inside my own head, I finally noticed them. My new driver, Caleb, started suggesting slight detours on our route to the corporate office. Nothing dramatic. Just taking the park road instead, right when the cherry blossoms were in full bloom. Or stopping at a bakery after a board meeting because he somehow noticed I hadn't eaten anything by noon. My kitchen staff had already warned him I wasn't touching my dinner, either. He never made a big fuss about it. He just offered, letting me decide. I always went along with it. I didn't want to overthink why. Our conversations grew the exact same way, in tiny, completely unforced little steps. One afternoon I asked him why he finally quit. Long-haul trucking, I mean. He answered in that same steady voice he always used. He couldn't stand being away from Grace. I asked if it was tough giving up that kind of steady paycheck. He admitted it was incredibly hard, but he'd make the exact same choice tomorrow. I just stared at him. Then I went back to my tablet and we sat in silence for 20 minutes. But let me tell you, that silence felt completely different than before. Caleb never pressed me about the car crash. He never mentioned Derek. He didn't ask about the board of directors, or if I was secretly terrified. Those were the only topics everyone else in my life kept circling. Carefully or clumsily, but absolutely constantly. Caleb seemed to decide that my personal tragedies were mine to share on my own timeline, and until then we had other things to discuss. The weather, or Grace's latest obsession with glowing deep-sea creatures. The pure absurdity of certain highway on-ramps. Whether that downtown streetcart coffee was actually better, or if I only loved it because I was finally getting some fresh air. I actually started laughing again, not a polite fake chuckle. Real, honest laughter. Once over a joke Grace made, and once when Caleb roasted a meter maid over some wildly specific traffic cone placement. Those laughs were brief and tiny, and honestly, they completely startled me both times. Amelia noticed it, Lucas Bennett noticed. My mother, Hannah Whitmore, called from Boston and declared, "You sound completely different, Eleanor." She didn't say better. My mother was always cautious, but she definitely said different. Grace had started drawing these little pictures, leaving them tucked in the sedan's back seat for me. Mostly ocean animals, complete with wild names she made up. One afternoon I found a drawing of a woman in a wheelchair staring at the sky, wearing a crown made of what looked like bright starfish. Scrawled at the bottom in shaky block letters, "For the pretty wheelchair lady." I held that piece of paper for a long time, totally speechless. I sat in the back seat, completely alone. I let myself cry for about 45 seconds. That was the longest I'd cried since leaving the hospital. Then I carefully folded his daughter's drawing, tucking it safely inside my jacket pocket. That was the day Caleb finally told me about Rachel, about his wife. He wasn't begging for sympathy. He just shared it as a fact, like he'd finally decided I earned the right to know. He told me very simply that she had been ill. A rare autoimmune condition. It progressed faster than anyone predicted. Rachel was only 31 years old. Little Grace was just 3. For several months after she passed, he existed in a state he described, with typical understatement, as totally non-functional. He dragged himself out of it because he had to. Grace needed her father. Not because he magically figured life out or truly healed in any way, but because a little girl needed him there, so he chose to show up. I quietly asked him how he actually survived it. He kept his eyes on the road. "Most days I didn't live because I wanted to," he said. "I lived because she needed breakfast." I sat in the back, silently absorbing that. "That's an honest answer," I finally whispered. "It's the only one I've got," he replied. That changed me. I started showing up to physical therapy with something entirely new, genuine attention. Absolute focus. I pushed myself harder and I asked Lucas sharper questions. I stopped seeing the exercises as miserable chores, treating them instead like business problems to solve. Lucas called it a massive behavioral shift. He was smart enough not to guess out loud about where my new fire came from. You and I know healing takes time. By late April, I was still in the wheelchair. I still faced mornings that were pitch black and painfully quiet, but I was finally moving forward, not running away. And the difference between those two directions meant absolutely everything. My rival Sebastian Hale could always read a room, and my room had clearly changed. He first noticed my shift during a board prep meeting in mid-April. I was sitting at the head of the table, showing a fierce sharpness that had been entirely missing for months. I quickly cut off 2 digressions. I caught a massive discrepancy in the quarterly projections that 3 executives missed entirely. Then I left the room in that heavy, purposeful silence that always preceded my biggest moves. I learned later that Sebastian drove home that night seething. Let's look at his plan. He spent 8 months patiently feeding the board a lie. His narrative claimed I wasn't recovering at all, that my corporate judgment was completely compromised, that my company needed stable leadership, and that stable leadership conveniently looked exactly like Sebastian. He already had 3 board members feeling sympathetic towards him. One was actively in his corner. And a full leadership transition proposal sat quietly waiting inside an encrypted folder on his laptop. He had been waiting for me to finally collapse under my own heavy weight. I was highly inconveniently refusing to collapse, so he targeted my driver. A few discreet background checks through a private corporate investigator quickly exposed Caleb's hidden struggles. Caleb was deeply financially exposed and falling significantly behind on rent. He faced a vicious custody battle with his in-laws, 0 savings, absolutely no safety net. He had found a pressure point. Sebastian loved exploiting pressure points. He arranged a secret meeting through an intermediary. Picture this, a quick, untraceable coffee somewhere neutral. Sebastian made me an offer with the bluntness of a corporate takeover. A massive payout in exchange for my immediate resignation, 0 explanation needed. I listened to his entire pitch with a deadpan face, then I said no. Sebastian clearly didn't expect that. The shock annoyed him more than my refusal. Guys in my position always said yes. The math was pretty simple. He tried again, bluntly making it clear that refusing him was a terrible idea. I simply told him, I heard you the first time. I got up and walked out, so Sebastian pivoted to plan 2. He started spreading a rumor, never directly, of course. He used that careful web of whispers and corporate implications he spoke so well. The lie was that I had manipulated my relationship with Eleanor for my own strategic gain. That my influence over her decisions was a huge liability the board needed to address. That a disabled, vulnerable CEO, getting emotionally attached to her unvetted driver, was a major corporate governance concern. The rumor grew legs. 2 corporate board members started asking questions. One even demanded an independent review. Hannah Whitmore flew in from Boston, dragging Eleanor into a brutal phone call to urge extreme caution. The press caught wind of the scandal and ran a piece. It featured a photo of Grace and me outside the mansion. They cropped it to make things look far more intimate than reality. Eleanor saw the article that Tuesday evening. I could tell a cold, sharp fury completely consumed her. When I showed up the next morning, I instantly knew the atmosphere had shifted. Eleanor sat perfectly still. That rigid control meant she was fighting hard to keep herself together. She locked eyes with me the second I walked in and said, without any hesitation, "Are you planning to quit?" I answered honestly, "I've been thinking about it." My bluntness, the fact that I didn't try to deny her fears, it cut through something she clearly hadn't expected to feel. She went totally quiet, then she asked extremely carefully, "Why?" "Because all this media noise is just getting in your way." I told her, "And you don't need me making things harder for you." Eleanor stared at me for a long time. I could see something shifting behind her eyes. An emotion she wasn't used to feeling and didn't quite know how to handle yet. When she finally spoke, her voice was steady but barely holding on. "You are the only person in my life right now," she whispered, "who makes me feel like I'm not already dead." Those words hung heavy in the quiet mansion. Neither of us dared to move a muscle. I didn't say anything back right away. I just stood there gripping her car keys, wrestling with the hardest choice of my life. I made my final decision right there, entirely on my own. Finally, I nodded. "Okay, I'll stay." I dropped the keys onto the table and went outside to bring her car around. Stick with me, because Sebastian's massive corporate scheme didn't fall apart from some dramatic discovery. It actually unraveled from a tiny practical detail I happened to notice that Wednesday morning. I was just checking her sedan's service records, an old habit from my driving days. His past taught him that ignoring small mechanical anomalies was the quickest route to breaking down on the freezing shoulder of Interstate 90 in January. That is why he noticed my car's vehicle file from the night of. My terrible accident had a service notation that was amended twice. You and I know those mundane administrative tweaks could mean absolutely nothing or mean exactly one very specific thing. The initial inspection actually flagged an anomaly in my braking system before the car left that evening. Yet the altered version didn't mention it. Caleb didn't say a single word to me. He called Owen Price instead. Owen Price was Whitmore Dynamics' chief legal counsel, a precise, cautious man in his late 50s who served our car company for over a decade and possessed one distinguishing quality that made him incredibly valuable above everyone else. He was never terrified of the harsh truth when he uncovered it. Caleb laid out what he observed, calmly and specifically, while Owen just listened without interrupting. Owen made 2 calls that afternoon. What surfaced over the next 10 days was incredibly unsettling. They found a shady conversation between a routine service contractor maintaining our fleet and someone with a direct line into my company's internal scheduling system. That very conversation happened 48 hours before my devastating accident. My service log was altered after the crash, quietly and highly professionally, by someone with both the clearance and the dark motivation to make a paper trail vanish. Owen handed Caleb the name of a former city traffic investigator he deeply trusted, and Caleb tapped a reliable contact from his long-haul days, a guy who spent years meticulously logging major roadside incidents to identify exactly which traffic monitoring systems covered my accident's route. What the footage finally showed was not ambiguous. Let's take a closer look. My car suffered brake failure, not because of rain, and definitely not from driver error. My brake line was tampered with. The catastrophic failure was intentionally engineered. The single name at the end of every thread, buried at the bottom of the logs, deep within the contractor's call history. Behind the shell messages moving through my own company's internal communication system was Sebastian Hale. Caleb told me this on a quiet Sunday evening. He sat across from me in my mansion's main sitting room, explaining what he and Owen had uncovered in that exact same quiet, matter-of-fact tone he used for everything. He didn't editorialize at all. He didn't soften the blow. I didn't speak for almost 3 minutes after he finally finished. I sat perfectly still, the kind of stillness that isn't peace but the exact opposite. The absolute, terrifying compression of something massive before it moves. I always knew Sebastian was ambitious. I fully knew he was calculating. But I hadn't known, never let myself truly consider that he was this. Marcus was dead because of this. I was confined to this wheelchair because of this. You see, it wasn't bad luck, weather, or the terrible randomness of a wet road at night. It happened because Sebastian Hale decided my severe disability was cheaper to manufacture than my removal. I looked right at Caleb and said, with a chilling quietness that was far more frightening than anger, "How long have you known?" 2 weeks, he told us. I wanted to be certain before I told you. I watched Eleanor nod slowly. That same week, Sebastian sent her an official message demanding her presence. He scheduled an emergency board of directors meeting for the very next Friday. On paper, just standard corporate forward planning, but you and I know the truth. Sebastian had the votes, he had his plan. He fully intended to walk out of that boardroom holding her resignation. He'd spent 11 months orchestrating this exact takeover. Eleanor simply replied she'd attend. 3 days later, I watched her and Owen walk federal agents through everything. The night before the big meeting, my daughter Grace drew a little lion. She left it right on the back seat of my car, adding a note. Written in her messy kid handwriting, "You are the lion." I found it before picking Eleanor up. I didn't say a word, just set it beside her. Eleanor stared at it during our entire drive into Manhattan. She stayed quiet but gripped it tight. We finally arrived at the 42nd floor boardroom of Whitmore. The Dynamics corporate headquarters featured a massive window wall, overlooking the entire city skyline. On that crisp Friday morning in late May, sunlight cut right through, horizontal and blinding. It made the massive wooden conference table look almost like a ceremonial altar. Sebastian Hale showed up early. He grabbed the seat just right of center. Not Eleanor's main head chair, but close enough to assert his dominance. He looked extremely comfortable. He'd planned this corporate coup the way he did everything, with absolute, ruthless precision. He had backups and backup plans for every single thing he thought might happen. But here's what he hadn't planned for. Eleanor Whitmore wheeling into that boardroom, looking exactly like her old powerful self. She rolled through those double doors at 9. Amelia followed, and I trailed 3 steps behind, keeping my usual blank driver's expression. Eleanor rocked a sharp navy business suit she hadn't touched since the car crash. Her hair was pinned up. Her hands pushed those wheels with total confidence. I watched Sebastian stare as she crossed the room. For the first time in forever, he felt something he probably didn't even recognize as pure doubt. She calmly greeted every board member by name. Picture this. She parks at the head of the table unassisted, slapping a single folder down. Sebastian started his speech with totally practiced smoothness. He thanked the executives for attending. He praised the company's solid financial quarter. Then, armed with this deeply fake rehearsed sadness, he slid right into his primary central argument. The urgent issue of leadership stability. The whole question of Eleanor's capacity. Whether, given the brutal crash, she could really guide the business into its next phase. He never outright called her unfit. He just claimed the stakeholders deserved absolute certainty. He faked compassion perfectly. I saw 3 board members nodding along. One guy even checked his phone. My boss waited patiently until Sebastian finished. Then she simply said, "Thank you, Sebastian." She cracked open that file. The first paper she slapped onto the table was the original certified vehicle service record, the real one. Sourced through Owen's legal team, she calmly explained exactly what the hidden evidence proved. You can guess what came next. the corrupt contractor's communication log. The third document, a printed transcript of those calls. The fourth was a deep forensic analysis of my brakes, prepared by the private investigator we had hired, confirming my crash wasn't just mechanical wear, it was deliberate sabotage. I let each page sit for 30 seconds, long enough for the boardroom to fully process it. Then I looked right at them. My crash wasn't an accident, I said. The boardroom went so dead quiet, you could hear the air conditioning. Sebastian had gone completely still. His face went totally blank, like his brain's processing power had just short-circuited entirely. I stared right at him. You made a massive miscalculation, I said. You assumed that breaking my body would break my spirit entirely. You figured everyone around me would just act exactly the way you do. That everything has a price tag and everyone can be bought. I paused. I added, one person didn't play your game, because sometimes the people hired to serve us end up saving us. The whole room's attention shifted, briefly and collectively, right over to Caleb. Standing near the back wall with that practiced invisibility of a man who drove people for a living, deciding this corporate showdown wasn't his moment. Sebastian tried to speak. He managed half a sentence about fake document provenance before Owen. Price cut him off, using the precise courtesy of a man who's spent decades delivering terrible news in the most legally airtight manner possible. At Owen's signal, 2 FBI agents waiting in our lobby finally came upstairs. Sebastian didn't even make a scene. He was the type of man who truly believed his own lies, right up until the exact moment hard evidence completely shattered his arranged reality. He was escorted out between the agents. He had this stunned stillness, like his entire master plan had just vanished into thin air. Those final charges were massive: corporate fraud, extreme financial misconduct, and conspiracy to cause grievous bodily harm. Building this legal case would take 18 grueling months to resolve. Sebastian never stepped foot in my building again. Stick with me here. After those doors closed, the boardroom stayed incredibly quiet. Then I looked around the table, staring down the very board members Sebastian had secretly bought off over the past year. I didn't feel like a triumphant CEO, just exhausted, clear-headed, and completely present. I want to discuss the next 2 years, I told them. If anyone here still doubts my capacity to lead this company, I'd rather hear them now, instead of during a series of cowardly private meetings. Dead silence. I opened a second file folder and officially began the meeting. Caleb slipped out quietly 20 minutes later. He went downstairs to my car and ate the sandwich he had packed that morning. He texted his daughter's school to confirm Grace's afternoon pickup. Then he just leaned back in the driver's seat, staring upward. He felt a quiet, specific satisfaction wash over him, a rare feeling living right between deep pride and absolute relief. He sat there and thought about his late wife, Rachel, the way he sometimes let himself do during quiet, idle moments, thinking she would have actually found me, his boss, interesting. Stick with me here. Eleanor always liked complicated people who were actually worth the effort. I was still mulling that over when Eleanor finally came downstairs 2 hours later. The summer that followed felt slower, much lighter than any she had lived in years. My personal investigation wrapped quickly. Whitmore Dynamics stabilized fast once we finally pushed Sebastian off the corporate board. Forensic accountants dug in and the dark truth surfaced. He had deliberately cooked the books, trying to wreck the board's confidence in her entirely. With his lies fully exposed, the corporate balance sheet was actually far stronger than anyone realized. She began carefully rebuilding her executive team. She hired a new CFO from Boston, a truly brilliant woman named Patricia Landis. She had that sharp, cold intelligence Eleanor recognized in herself. She completely restructured 2 failing divisions and accepted 3 speaking gigs she had dodged all last year. She kept up physical therapy with Lucas, but that entire dynamic had completely shifted too. She just stopped trying to prove her worth to others and started pushing to see what her broken body could still actually do. The healing was painfully slow and real, totally unpredictable, exactly the way genuine physical recovery always is. No clean Hollywood ending, no straight line, just stubborn, grinding biological progress. By late August, she stood with support. Not walking, maybe never the same way again, but standing tall and totally upright. gripping the parallel bars in Lucas's room for 23 seconds the first time, and 41 the second time. And she stopped counting after that, mostly because she finally quit, caring about raw numbers, and started focusing entirely on the feeling. That feeling was absolutely incredible. Now picture this. Late September Leadership Summit, 300 employees, the executives, and the board. It was the first one she had attended since the crash. The previous year, she had only sent a quick video. She recorded that from her dark study, heavy curtains pulled tight behind her, and she couldn't even bring herself to watch it afterward. But this year, she attended in person. She totally improvised what happened right after finishing her opening remarks. She had penned a sharp, strategic, incredibly forward-looking speech. She nailed the delivery, but instead of grabbing her wheelchair wheels to roll back from the main speaker's table, something deep inside just made her stop. She grabbed the edge of the heavy wooden table instead. Lucas watched quietly from the back of the room. He was technically invited as Amelia's +1, but I saw him tense up the second he realized exactly what Eleanor was about to do. She shoved herself totally upright, firmly gripping that wooden table. Her arms shook from the massive effort as the entire room fell dead silent. She held her ground. The clock on the back wall said it lasted 11 seconds. But it felt like a total lifetime. My daughter Grace hid in the side hall, since kids weren't allowed in the corporate space. But she was there because I couldn't find a babysitter, and Amelia told us this was a truly special circumstance. You should know, my daughter watched it all through that glass panel. When I finally stood, Grace pushed the door open, sprinting across the boardroom with the absolute disregard for protocol that remains the exclusive privilege of 7-year-olds in moments of pure feeling. She flung her little arms around my waist, speaking loudly and clearly into the suddenly very quiet room. I knew you could do it. I knew the whole entire time. I slowly sat back down. I placed a shaking hand on Grace's hair and held her close. I didn't cry. I wasn't going to cry in front of 300 people, and I didn't, but my eyes definitely burned and my hands were far from steady. And across the room, Caleb, who was casually leaning against the far wall with his arms crossed, looked down at the floor, the exact way you and I do when we're desperately keeping heavy emotions locked inside. Afterward, down in the parking garage, I sat in the back of my sedan while Caleb loaded up my wheelchair. The summit crowd was slowly filtering out around us. Echoing voices and footsteps blended with the distant elevator hum. Grace had completely crashed beside me. Her cheek rested against my arm, one small hand still faintly gripping my blazer sleeve. She is out cold, Caleb whispered, glancing back as he slid into the driver's seat. I noticed, I replied softly. I looked down at little Grace for a moment. Then I looked up. I want to tell you something. He waited in silence. You didn't fix my legs, I said. I really want you to know that I fully understand that. You didn't come in here and magically solve the medical problem or change my physical reality. I am still stuck in this chair. I might always be in this chair. I paused, but somewhere between that earlier conversation about the wheelchair ramp and Grace's drawings and whatever it was you said about breakfast, I started believing I was worth fixing. I truly hadn't felt that way in a long time, maybe not since before the crash. Caleb stayed completely quiet for a second. Outside, a car moved past. I think you would have gotten there anyway, he said. Maybe, I murmured, but I definitely got there faster. We drove home through that September evening, the city warm and glowing around us. Grace slept soundly in the back, her small hand still curled tightly around the sleeve of my business jacket. Caleb drove exactly the way he always drove, steady, totally unhurried, both hands firmly on the wheel. I quietly watched the bright city move past my window. I thought about everything I just said, about what he hadn't said back, and about that very particular quality of silence existing between two people who aren't quite ready to say the most important thing. We've all felt it. I would really like to know, I said, not looking at him, whether you think about all this differently than I do. He glanced at me in the mirror. Think about what? He asked. I kept my eyes fixed firmly on the window. Whether this is just a job to you. The heavy pause that followed was long enough to be an answer of its own. When he finally spoke, his tone was that exact same even register he used for everything. But I had learned over these past months that his evenness wasn't the same as absence. It stopped being just a job, he said quietly, around the time you put Grace's drawing in your jacket. I finally looked right at him then, through the mirror. He met my eyes for just a brief second before looking back at the dark road. I didn't say anything else, neither did he. Back at my mansion, he helped with my chair. Our hands overlapped in our practiced routine of 100 transfers, but neither pulled away. Sometimes the people hired to serve us become the very ones who save us. The night was completely silent around us. Grace stirred softly in my back seat. City lights hid the stars, but the sky above us was perfectly clear. Caleb whispered from the front, "I'm not going anywhere." I studied him for a long moment before answering, "Good." 3 weeks later, a crisp Sunday afternoon in October, Caleb pushed my wheelchair down the winding path running through Binney Park in Greenwich. The maples had turned. Sunlight slanted perfectly through the bright orange and gold leaves. The whole world carried that specific autumn Sunday feeling, like the year itself taking a slow, clean breath right before everything shifts. His daughter Grace dashed ahead of us, arms spread out wide. She loudly narrated a highly complex adventure involving a brave crew of marine biologists discovering a brand new species of glowing crab. She paused every so often to report her latest findings, addressing them directly to me. I had learned to treat her little monologues with the absolute seriousness they actually deserved. I held a warm coffee from the cart by the east entrance. Caleb kept his hands on my chair. We weren't talking, which felt perfectly fine. We had mastered the art of productive silence, the rare kind that doesn't demand filling. A woman walked her golden retriever past us, smiling warmly at the three of us. That automatic happy grin people give folks who look like a family on Sunday afternoons. I just watched her go. Have you ever noticed how a passing smile can mean so many things at once? How it's a complete assumption, a total accident, yet somehow still perfectly right. For most of the past year, I truly believed my life ended on November 14th. That whatever survived that awful car crash wasn't actually living, but just some grim administrative process managing the wreckage of the CEO I once was. I was entirely willing to just run out that clock with a kind of dignified exhaustion that I had foolishly mistaken for acceptance. What I finally understood now. Sitting in the autumn light, holding my coffee, feeling my driver's steady hands on my chair, and a 7-year-old shouting new taxonomic names at the geese, was that the crash really had ended one version of me. The former CEO who ran purely on control and isolation, and the stubborn belief that total self-sufficiency was identical to safety. That woman was fast, brilliant, and real. I still mourn her, and it's always incredibly complicated. But the woman I am now, slower, deeply uncertain, unable to pretend I am totally unaffected, is absolutely not lesser. It is simply different, and it actually belongs to me. Ultimately, it feels way more honest than anything I had been before. Grace sprinted back to us at full speed, grabbing my wheelchair tightly with both hands. She gasped breathlessly, "There are actual swans, 2 of them. We have to go look right now." Immediately, I replied, "Lead the way." Grace took off again, keeping one arm extended behind her to guarantee we were following. Caleb gently pushed my chair forward, and together we went to see the swans. You and I know I once thought losing bodily control was the world's most terrifying thing. I had been completely wrong. Look, the real terror is believing you're worthless once your executive control is stripped away. Then I hired Caleb Hunter as my personal driver, a quiet dad raising an ocean-obsessed kid. He had this way of looking at broken wheelchair ramps that, somehow, totally rebuilt my shattered confidence and handed my self-worth right back to me. He did it slowly, no big fuss, just the way true, lasting healing actually happens. No grand CEO gestures or empty promises, just through breakfast. Through arriving 2 minutes early, reminding me I wasn't weak. The ramp is just poorly designed. Through simply staying. I honestly thought my story ended the night my car smashed into that concrete barrier on a rainy Manhattan street. But stick with me, stories rarely end where we expect. Sometimes your true ending is much quieter than the tragic crash. A simple October Sunday. Hot coffee in hand, my driver's little girl shouting about swans she was certain I needed to see. Because sometimes the miracle is not standing up again. Sometimes the real miracle is just finding a reason to keep pushing forward and understanding. You and I both know that reason doesn't need to be massive to be enough.